The first snow of the season came early to Pine Ridge, Montana. By mid-October, the aspens had already turned gold, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the valley every morning. For most folks in this small mountain town, winter preparation meant stocking up on firewood, checking the generator, and making sure the roof could handle the weight of months of snowfall. For Jacob Miller, it meant something different. It meant proving everyone wrong. Jacob had moved to Pine Ridge 3 years ago from Seattle, tired of the corporate grind and hungry for a simpler life. He bought 10 acres of land at the edge of town, near the national forest, and decided to build his own cabin from scratch. Not a kit cabin, not something prefabricated. A real cabin, built with his own 2 hands. He was 32 years old, lean and wiry, with calloused hands and a quiet determination that some people mistook for stubbornness. His hair was always a little too long, tucked behind his ears, and he wore the same flannel jacket nearly every day. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were measured and careful. The problem was, Jacob didn't have a background in construction. He'd been a software engineer. He learned everything from books, YouTube videos, and trial and error. And in a town like Pine Ridge, where most men had been swinging hammers since they were 12, that made him an outsider. When he started framing the roof of his cabin that summer, people noticed something unusual. His rafters were shorter than standard. Not by much, maybe 18 inches, but enough to stand out. Enough to get people talking. Tom Garrison was the first to say something. Tom owned the hardware store on Main Street and had built half the houses in Pine Ridge over the past 30 years. He was a big man with a thick gray beard and a laugh that could fill a room. One afternoon in July, Tom stopped by Jacob's property on his way home. Jacob was up on the roof, nailing down the ridge beam, sweat dripping down his face. "Hey there, Jacob," Tom called up. He shaded his eyes against the sun. "Mind if I take a look at what you got going on?" Jacob climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Sure. What do you think?" Tom walked around the structure, hands on his hips, nodding slowly. Then he stopped and looked up at the roof frame. "Those rafters," he said, pointing. "They seem a little short. You planning on extending them?" Jacob shook his head. "No, that's the design." Tom frowned. "You know we get a lot of snow up here, right? Heavy snow. Those rafters need to stick out farther to handle the load and shed the snow properly. Otherwise, you're gonna have problems come winter." Jacob's jaw tightened. "I calculated the load. The shorter rafters distribute the weight more evenly across the center beam. Less leverage means less stress on the joints." Tom let out a low chuckle. "Well, I don't know about all that engineering talk, but I know what works in the mountains. And short rafters ain't it." He clapped Jacob on the shoulder, still smiling, but there was something patronizing in the gesture. "You might want to rethink that, son. Just some friendly advice." After Tom left, Jacob stood there for a long time, staring up at his roof. He knew his math was right. He'd checked it a dozen times. But doubt crept in anyway. Word spread fast. By the end of the week, half the town had heard about Jacob's short rafters. At the diner, people whispered about it over coffee. At the post office, old-timers shook their heads. Even the young guys at the lumberyard made jokes. "Poor guy," one of them said, loading 2x4s into a truck. "He's gonna be buried under his own roof by Christmas." Jacob heard the talk. He felt the stares whenever he drove into town for supplies. But he didn't change his design. He kept building. By September, his cabin was nearly finished. It was small but solid, with wide windows facing the forest and a stone fireplace he'd built himself. The roof was steep and tight, the rafters exactly as he'd planned them. Meanwhile, other cabins were going up around Pine Ridge. A wealthy couple from California had hired a contractor to build a luxury retreat on the north side of town. The Hendersons, an older couple, were adding a new wing to their home. And the Parkers, a young family, were putting up a big cabin near the river. All of them followed the traditional rafter design. Long overhangs, standard spacing, the way it had always been done. Jacob drove past these construction sites sometimes, and he could feel the weight of their certainty. The unspoken message was clear. They knew better. They'd done it right, and he hadn't. But Jacob didn't say anything. He just went home and kept working. October arrived with cold winds and dark clouds. The weather forecast called for an early winter, possibly the heaviest snowfall in a decade. Jacob stood on his porch one evening, watching the sky turn purple over the mountains. His cabin was finished. His roof was ready. Now all he could do was wait. The first real snow hit Pine Ridge on November 8th. It wasn't just a dusting. It was a full blizzard that lasted 3 days straight, dumping nearly 2 feet of heavy, wet snow across the valley. Jacob spent those days inside his cabin, keeping the fire going and watching through the window as the world turned white. His roof held perfectly. No creaking, no groaning. The snow piled up evenly across the surface, just as he'd calculated. When the storm finally broke, he bundled up and went outside to check the structure. Everything looked solid. The rafters hadn't budged. He felt a quiet sense of relief, maybe even a flicker of pride. But when he drove into town that afternoon for supplies, the mood was different. Several of the newer constructions were already showing problems. The luxury cabin on the north side had developed a sag in the center of the roof. Not dramatic, but visible. The contractor had to bring in emergency supports. The Hendersons' new addition had ice dams forming along the extended rafters, causing water to back up under the shingles. At the hardware store, Tom Garrison was holding court near the cash register, surrounded by worried homeowners. "I'm telling you," Tom said, shaking his head, "this is just the beginning. We got 4 more months of winter ahead of us. If your roof is already showing stress, you better do something now before it gets worse." Someone mentioned the Parkers' cabin. The long rafters on their build were bowing slightly under the snow load. Not dangerous yet, but concerning. Jacob grabbed what he needed and headed to the counter. Tom looked up and saw him. Well, Tom said loudly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it isn't our engineer. How's that fancy roof of yours holding up?" "Jacob?" The room went quiet. All eyes turned to him. "It's fine," Jacob said simply. Tom grinned. "Fine, huh? No problems at all?" "None." Tom exchanged glances with the other men. "Well, give it time, son. Winter's just getting started. Those short rafters might feel fine now, but wait till we get another storm or two. You'll see what I mean." A few people chuckled. Jacob felt his face flush, but he kept his expression neutral. He paid for his supplies and left without another word. Outside, he sat in his truck for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He knew his design was sound. He knew it, but the constant doubt, the mockery, the way everyone seemed so certain he was wrong, it was wearing on him. That evening, as he sat by the fire in his cabin, Jacob made a decision. He wouldn't defend himself anymore. He wouldn't argue or explain. He would just let his work speak for itself. But deep down, a small voice whispered, "What if they're right?" December arrived with a vengeance. The second storm was worse than the first. 4 feet of snow in 5 days. The temperature dropped to -15, and the wind howled through the valley like something alive and angry. Jacob watched from his window as the snow kept falling. His roof remained solid, the weight distributed exactly as he'd planned. But he wondered about the others, about the cabins with the long rafters, about Tom's certainty and the town's judgment. On the 6th day, when the storm finally cleared, Jacob's phone rang. It was Sarah Chun, a park ranger he'd become friendly with over the past year. She lived on the east side of town. "Jacob," she said, her voice tight with worry, "have you been outside yet?" "No." "Why? You need to see this. Meet me at Main Street in 20 minutes. He threw on his coat and drove into town. What he saw made his stomach drop. The Parkers' cabin had partially collapsed. The long rafters, heavy with snow and ice, had sagged so severely that the center beam cracked. Part of the roof had caved in during the night. The family was safe. They'd been staying with relatives in town, but their new home was destroyed. The luxury cabin on the north side wasn't much better. The emergency supports had failed. The entire structure was condemned pending major repairs. Even some of the older homes in Pine Ridge, homes that had stood for decades, were showing dangerous stress. The extended rafters, designed for typical snowfall, couldn't handle the extreme weight. Sarah stood next to Jacob on Main Street, surveying the damage. 8 buildings, she said quietly. 8 buildings with structural damage. Some of them might be total losses. Jacob felt something twist in his chest. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Just a deep, aching sadness for his neighbors. Tom Garrison's hardware store was packed. People were buying emergency lumber, jacks, anything to shore up their roofs before the next storm hit. Tom himself looked exhausted, his usual booming voice subdued. When he saw Jacob, he stopped mid-sentence. The store went quiet. "Your place," Tom said finally. "How's your place?" Jacob hesitated, still standing. "No damage." Tom stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his eyes. If you've been following this story and wondering whether doing things differently can actually work, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next is going to change everything in Pine Ridge. Sarah touched Jacob's arm. "Some people are going to want to talk to you," she said. "About your design. About how your roof is the only new construction still intact." Jacob looked around at the worried faces, at the damaged buildings visible through the store windows, at the community he tried so hard to become part of. "I'll help however I can," he said. The next morning, Jacob's phone didn't stop ringing. First it was the Hendersons, asking if he could look at their sagging addition. Then the Parkers, desperate to salvage what remained of their cabin. By noon, even the contractor from California was calling, humble and professional, asking for advice on reinforcing the luxury retreat. Jacob spent the next 3 weeks working alongside Tom Garrison and a crew of local builders. He showed them his calculations, explained the physics of load distribution, demonstrated how shorter rafters with reinforced center beams could handle extreme weight without the stress fractures that longer overhangs created. Tom listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions. Gone was the patronizing smile, replaced by genuine curiosity. "I've been building the same way for 30 years, Tom admitted one frozen afternoon as they worked on the Henderson place. "Never thought to question it. Just did what my father taught me, what his father taught him." Jacob hammered in another support beam. "Sometimes the old ways work. Sometimes they need updating." Tom nodded slowly. "You know what the difference is between you and me? I learned by doing. You learned by thinking. Turns out we need both." By January, Jacob had helped repair or reinforce 12 buildings. He refused payment from most people, accepting only materials costs. For families like the Parkers who'd lost everything, he worked for free. Word spread beyond Pine Ridge. A reporter from the Billings Gazette drove up to interview him. The article ran with the headline, "Seattle Engineer Saves Montana Town with Unconventional Design." Jacob hated the attention, but he couldn't deny what it meant for the community. Building inspectors started recommending his rafter design for mountain construction. Architecture students from the university in Missoula came to study his cabin. The real turning point came in late January, when the town council held a meeting about updating building codes. Jacob was invited to present his findings. The community center was packed. Jacob stood at the front, his laptop connected to a projector showing stress diagrams and load calculations. He explained how climate change meant heavier, wetter snow, how traditional designs needed adaptation. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Tom Garrison stood up. "I've known most of you my whole life," he said, his voice carrying to every corner. "And I was wrong about this man. Dead wrong. He came here as an outsider, and instead of following what we told him, he thought for himself. And because of that, families still have homes standing." Tom turned to Jacob. "I mocked you. We all did. And I'm sorry." The applause started small, then grew. People stood. Jacob felt his throat tighten. The council voted unanimously to revise the building codes, incorporating Jacob's design principles as recommended standards for new mountain construction. Spring came late to Pine Ridge that year. The snow didn't fully melt until mid-April, revealing a town forever changed by the brutal winter. Jacob stood on his porch one morning in May, coffee in hand, watching the meadow behind his cabin turn green. The aspens were budding, and he could hear the creek running high with snowmelt. His phone buzzed. It was an email from a structural engineering firm in Bozeman, offering him a consulting position. They wanted him to review mountain construction projects across Montana. Good pay, flexible hours, the recognition he'd never sought in Seattle. He set the phone down and smiled quietly. A year ago, he would have jumped at the opportunity. But now, things were different. Tom Garrison had offered him a partnership in expanding the hardware store into a full construction consultation business. The Hendersons wanted him to design an addition to their guest house. Sarah Chun was talking about building a new ranger station and wanted his input on the design. But more than the work, more than the opportunities, what had changed was something deeper. Pine Ridge felt like home now. That evening, the town held its annual spring barbecue at the community center. Jacob arrived late, still uncomfortable with crowds, but Sarah spotted him immediately and waved him over. "There he is," Tom boomed, flipping burgers on the massive grill. "The man who saved our roofs." Jacob shook his head. "You all saved your own roofs. I just shared what I knew." "Don't be modest," Mrs. Henderson said, bringing over a plate of her famous potato salad. "You gave our family our home back." The Parkers approached, their 2 kids running ahead. "Mr. Miller," the oldest boy said excitedly, "Dad says you're going to help us rebuild our cabin this summer." Jacob knelt down to the boy's level. "That's right. And this time we're going to build it so strong that nothing can knock it down." As the evening wore on, Jacob found himself surrounded by conversations. People asking advice, sharing stories, laughing. The same people who'd whispered about him 6 months ago now treated him like he'd always belonged. Tom pulled him aside as the sun began setting behind the mountains. "You know what I realized?" Tom said, his voice serious. "This town needed someone like you. Someone willing to do things differently. We'd gotten comfortable, set in our ways. You shook that up." Jacob looked out at the community gathered together, rebuilding, stronger than before. "I just built a cabin the way I thought was right." Tom clapped him on the shoulder, but this time there was nothing patronizing about it. It was the gesture of an equal, a friend. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to stand by what they know is true, even when everyone else says they're wrong. Jacob smiled. "Even when Tom Garrison says they're wrong." Tom laughed, loud and genuine, especially then. 3 years later, Jacob stood in front of a classroom at Montana State University in Bozeman. 24 engineering students sat before him, notebooks open, eyes attentive. He clicked to the next slide. A photo of his cabin in Pine Ridge, covered in snow. "This is what happens when you trust your calculations over popular opinion," he said. "But more importantly, this is what happens when you build with respect for the environment you're in, not against it." A student raised her hand. "Professor Miller, is it true you had no formal construction training when you designed that cabin?" Jacob smiled. "That's true. I was a software engineer who watched a lot of YouTube videos and read every book I could find. But I understood physics. I understood load distribution, and I was willing to learn from my mistakes." After class, he drove back to Pine Ridge. The 2-hour journey had become a comfortable ritual. He taught 2 days a week at the university and spent the rest of his time in the mountains, running the construction consultation firm he'd built with Tom. The town had changed. New cabins dotted the hillsides, all built with updated rafter designs. The building codes Jacob helped write had been adopted across 3 counties. Even the luxury retreat had been rebuilt, the California couple hiring Jacob to oversee the entire project. His own cabin had expanded too. Sarah Chun had moved in 18 months ago, and they'd added a workshop and a greenhouse. She still worked as a ranger, and on weekends they hiked the trails together, her wilderness knowledge complementing his engineering mind perfectly. Tom Garrison, now in his 60s, had stepped back from daily work but still stopped by the office most mornings for coffee and stories. The partnership had grown into something neither of them expected, a friendship built on mutual respect and hard-won trust. As Jacob pulled into his driveway that evening, he saw smoke rising from the chimney. Sarah had gotten home first. Through the window, he could see her moving around the kitchen, probably starting dinner. He sat in his truck for a moment, looking up at the roof. The same roof everyone had mocked. The same short rafters that had held firm when everything else failed. It wasn't about being right, he realized. It had never been about that. It was about having the courage to trust yourself when no one else did. About staying true to what you knew was correct, even in the face of ridicule. About turning doubt into determination and mockery into meaning. The roof above him stood strong and solid, exactly as he designed it. Exactly as it would stand for decades to come. Thank you so much for watching this story until the very end. If it touched your heart or made you think differently about standing firm in your convictions, please hit that like button and leave a comment below. What's something you believed in when everyone else doubted you? Share your story. I'd love to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring true stories of people who trusted themselves against all odds. See you in the next one.